August 19th, 1944. The Wolfschanze in East Prussia, Red Ball Express, the supply line that turned trucks into a weapon. Not a battle, but a system. Thousands of engines, one direction, headlights burning against doctrine. 5,958 trucks moved 12,500 tons a day for 82 days. A logistics tempo Europe had never witnessed. So, why did German arithmetic insist Patton must halt? And why didn't he? From Cherbourg past Le Mans to the Seine and beyond, in August to November 1944, this road network fed the dash to Paris and the German frontier. Driven largely by African-American soldiers, about 3/4 of the drivers in a segregated army, Red Ball did more than move armies. It quickened debates on equality and proved how industrial velocity could reshape a nation. A German staff culture in late summer of 1944 trusted arithmetic the way sailors trust stars. Add the known constants and plot the course. An armored division on the move consumes roughly 150,000 gallons each day. A Sherman on roads drinks about 1/2 mile per gallon, worse over fields. An infantry division requires about 700 tons daily. An armored division, about 1,000. Patton's command drives a dozen divisions along a 60-mile frontage. Move such appetites several hundred miles from the Normandy beaches over roads the Germans themselves have torn, and the sum appears fatal. The line of reasoning felt as cold and clean as steel. At the Wolfschanze in East Prussia on the 19th of August, 1944, General Oberst Alfred Jodl read the Western reports and found reassurance in distance. To him and to many on the Wehrmacht Generalstab, supply lines were not metaphors, but wounds. Russia had taught them that momentum bleeds out when transport fails. In the East, they had watched trucks fracture on washboard tracks, horses, still 4/5 of German transport, lag behind Panzer points, and rail gauges strand cargo hundreds of miles from the fire line. Experience, that sternest teacher, whispered that the Americans had repeated the classic error, outrun the tail, and the teeth go dull. Yet experience can be a parochial tutor. What these officers carried forward was not merely memory. It was a model of Europe as a fixed economy of scarcity. Their algorithms assumed conservation, concealment after dusk, traffic dispersed, repairs painstakingly scheduled, rail the spine of movement, gasoline the coin to be hoarded. In such a frame, the emerging swing of Third Army toward the Seine could only be brief. The culminating point was not a possibility. It was a law. Here the historian must pause and mark the hinge. The facts that comforted Jodl were not wrong. The frame that held them was. The Americans were about to behave as if fuel were flow rather than stock. Trucks were consumables rather than heirlooms, and the night itself were an extra shift on the factory floor. They would run headlamps bright against doctrine, except that 1 in 5 vehicles might die on any given day, and schedule around that mortality as calmly as a plant manager budgets scrap. What looks to a thrifty army like waste is to an industrial army the price of tempo. Imagine then a second ledger open on the same day, not in East Prussia, but far to the west, where road markers were being hammered into hedgerows and military police rehearsed hand signals at crossroads. The columns on that page read differently. 5,958 trucks committed. 12,500 tons to move in every 24 hours. Convoys separated by 5 minutes. Speeds held between 25 and 35 miles per hour. Stops permitted only for fuel or true emergency. Mobile maintenance leapfrogged every few dozen miles to triage the inevitable breakdowns in 15 minutes or push them into ditches. The heading on the page borrowed railroad slang for priority freight. Red Ball Express. Military psychology has a term for the gap between what people have suffered and what they can imagine. Anchoring. The German anchor was the Ostfront. The American anchor was Detroit. One side optimized for preservation, the other for replacement. One side guarded nights, the other converted nights into throughput. One side read distance as attrition, the other read distance as cycle time. Foreshadow the bruising arithmetic that will follow. Within 72 hours of Jodl's confidence, Third Army will refuel at the Seine crossings. Within a week, Paris will be liberated. Within a month, American spearheads will touch the German frontier. None of that contradicts his numbers. All of it contradicts his premise. Logistics in 1944 is no longer the servant of strategy. It is its engine. And in the engine room, a nation that can afford to replace faster than it breaks writes new laws of motion. So, the chapter closes not with a bang, but with a pencil stroke. The sums in East Prussia balance elegantly. And they are wrong. The missing term is not a secret weapon. It is a political economy capable of turning trucks into a weapon and speed into policy. The road will make that truth audible soon enough, at 5-minute intervals, all night long. Before there was a convoy, there was a sentence that sounded like insubordination, spoken in a room that smelled of damp stone and gasoline. In a requisition chateau near Le Mans, on the 25th of August, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service proposed that doctrine was the wrong geometry for the problem. 2 roads would be made to behave like a machine, one for loads going forward, one for empties coming back. Trucks would run through the night with headlamps burning. Intervals would be counted out like a metronome. Anything too slow would be removed from the staff's imagined friction and set aside on the shoulder like a defective part. The plan read like a factory routing sheet translated into field orders. Convoys would leave at roughly 5-minute spacings. Speeds would be held between 25 and 35 miles an hour. There would be no stopping except for fuel or genuine emergency. Military police would police the cadence, pulling laggards and clearing intersections. Mobile maintenance echelons would leapfrog every few dozen miles, triaging the inevitable breakdowns. 15 minutes to fix or push into the ditch. The target was a simple, brutal production number, at least 12,500 tons every 24 hours. The code word borrowed from railroading, where a red dot meant absolute priority. Red Ball Express. Organizationally, this was not rebellion, but reframing. Railroads had long solved flow with priority timetables. Assembly plants had long accepted scrap rates to keep lines moving. Ayres imported those ideas into a battle space that still imagined logistics as a patient craft. The psychological shift is easy to miss because the vocabulary feels ordinary. In truth, it replaced the ethic of conservation with the ethic of availability. The point was not to avoid loss. The point was to budget loss so that tempo never broke. 36 hours later, on the 26th of August, the abstraction rolled. Drivers of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks bound east with 105mm shells for guns near Malin, roughly 300 miles away. The cabs were spare, a cracking bench seat, a dash that rattled, a hand-painted convoy number, and, more often than not, a nickname or slogan. Patton's Blood Bank. Detroit to Berlin Express. The work instruction was not poetry. Drive 20 out of every 24 hours, hold the interval, refuel fast, yield if you are slower, and if you die mechanically, accept the ditch. Sociologically, the workforce gave the operation its moral voltage. Of the roughly 23,000 drivers who would eventually run the route, about 3/4 were African American soldiers in a still segregated army. They brought with them not only skill, but a resilient shop floor culture, hand signals at night when horns were useless, unwritten rules about overtaking on grades, binning and labeling cannibalized parts, and the quiet habit of sharing rations with French children at halts despite regulations. The irony required no speech-making. Men who could not eat in many white restaurants at home were feeding the most celebrated white general in Europe at an industrial tempo. Where doctrine hesitated, standardization carried courage. The CCKW was not a marvel. It was a platform. Waterproofing allowed deep fords. The drivetrain tolerated indifferent fuel. Components were interchangeable. Engines could be swapped under a mobile crane in roughly 3/4 of an hour. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advance section, expressed the constraint as a number set, not an aspiration. 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles minimum, 90% availability. A textbook called This Impossible. American production treated it as a reorder point. The German view enters here through lenses and notebooks. By the last week of August, their reconnaissance detachments recorded what their doctrine had taught them never to display. Continuous columns, day and night, headlamps punching white tunnels through mist, spacing so tight a single brake tap might seem fatal. One report estimated headlamps visible for 20 kilometers, vehicles passing at half-minute intervals. The tone is part disbelief, part ethnography. They do not hide, they do not disperse. That was the method. Visibility was not negligence, but an index of confidence. Night as a second shift. Light as a promise that no enemy aircraft would meaningfully contest the sky. The economics of the road are the last piece of the pattern. Each decision traded inventory for time. A broken truck left in a ditch freed the entire queue behind it. A 15-minute triage rule saved hours of downstream delay. A 5-minute dispatch interval made the road behave like a moving assembly line, not a parade. Where German logistics thought in terms of protecting assets, American logistics thought in terms of protecting throughput. In an industrial society, the scarcest commodity is no longer metal, but momentum. By nightfall, the one-way idea felt less like a violation and more like a discovery. MPs at forks of hedgerow lanes had become metronomes. Maintenance crews, a roving emergency department, drivers, operators of a system larger than any one vehicle. The historian is allowed one metaphor so long as it clarifies. A road had been taught to act like a factory. The lesson would travel faster than the trucks. Within days, the sound of it, engines at interval, gears holding grade, would carry far beyond the Seine, all the way to staff tables in East Prussia, where arithmetic still assumed Europe's old scarcity. A week is a better instrument than a day for measuring a system. From the last days of August to the last night of that month in 1944, the Red Ball Express moved 89,939 tons, a daily cadence a little above 12,848 tons, over a round trip of roughly 686 miles, with about 5,958 trucks, averaging 1.5 runs in each 24-hour cycle. The road, in other words, had learned to behave like a line, cue discipline at dispatch, triage on the shoulder, and an unforgiving rule about stoppages, 15 minutes to fix or shove aside. The operation drank its own fuel at a rate near 300,000 gallons each day, and yet did not starve the front it served. The explanation lives partly offshore. Under the channel, Operation Pluto pushed gasoline through pipes that German intelligence did not properly price until too late. On the landward side, forward fuel parks sat about every 25 miles, and a parallel river of tanker trucks reduced refueling pauses to something like 10 minutes. What looks on a map like a bold arrow is, in the logistics eye, a settled flow regime. The Americans treated fuel not as a hoard to guard, but as a stream to accelerate. They budgeted loss, then bought back time. The moral acoustics mattered too. Headlights burned through mist against blackout doctrine. Engines marked a beat that German pickets learned to fear. Some units later reported phantom convoys when American psychological warfare teams broadcast engine noise into the dark. Evidence that the soundtrack of movement had become an instrument of war in its own right. Against that sound, the old grammar of concealment read like superstition. An enemy who does not hide is an enemy who does not believe you can meaningfully strike. To a staff trained on thrift, the American method looked like sabotage by abundance. Field Marshal Walter Model read composite reports by early September and glimpsed a social fact inside the arithmetic. A polity willing to waste vehicles and sleep to preserve tempo. Heinz Guderian, informed from East Prussia, initially dismissed reports of armored advances of 40 to 60 miles per day as error or propaganda. Intercepted American traffic erased the refuge of disbelief. What rattled the German mind was not a new weapon, but a new tolerance for attrition in service of flow. Engines replaced rather than rebuilt. Trucks abandoned so the convoy behind them did not clot. Inside the cabs, a different ledger was being written. The workforce was majority African American, about 3/4, in a still segregated army. They improvised a craft culture in hours, hand signals that read across rain, etiquette for overtaking on grades without killing the interval, a parts economy of cannibalization, with labels chalked on crates, and the unofficial practice of sharing rations with French children at halts. Their labor contradicted Nazi racial theory by performance and confronted American discrimination by fact. By the 5th day of September, the rhythm had a shape, convoys leaving every 5 minutes, an average of 67 vehicles, 5-ton nominal loads with 7-ton overloads not unusual, 14 hours one way for roughly 350 miles, 2 hours at each end for turnarounds, and something like 5,000 vehicles in motion at any moment. German observers alternated between branding these numbers as propaganda and confessing alarm. The more useful reading is doctrinal. On this network, mass is discipline. Throughput, not neatness, is the virtue. Availability, not preservation, is the ethic. The road made that ethic visible at 5-minute intervals all night. Every machine meets a load it should not bear. The first day of September provided a case study when the 4th Armored Division moved 35 miles before noon, met red ball trucks waiting with fuel and ammunition, then pushed another 32 miles by evening, 67 in a single day. German defensive planning had written 30 as a practical maximum. When the adversary rewrites a limit, tables go blind. The achievement was not a miracle of steel, but a choreography of cabs, hoses, and maps. Then the physics turned cruel. By the second week of September, the round trip had stretched beyond 700 miles. Drivers hallucinated from exhaustion. The daily deadline rate drifted toward 30%. On the 8th, General der Panzertruppe, Hesse von Manteuffel, reported widening convoy intervals, from 5 minutes to 15, and falling speeds. German staffers read those symptoms as the long-awaited culminating point. In the usual story, this is where momentum bleeds out. Instead, the system changed shape without changing aim. Within 72 hours, the Americans created intermediate transfer points that cut individual runs back to roughly 350 miles, instituted driver rotations that treated human endurance as a scheduled component, planted forward maintenance to capture failures earlier, and doubled the number of trucks invoked against the constraint. By the 12th, tonnage moved had increased. This is not romance. It is the grammar of decentralized adaptation. Shorten paths, increase redundancy, protect cadence. Air became a second road. On the 16th of September, observers counted about 900 C-47 sorties, lifting roughly 2,700 tons in a day. The comparison that German officers drew was involuntary. At its peak over Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe had managed around 300 tons daily and called it maximum effort. The American habit of treating loss as a line item and tempo as the objective turned airplanes into trucks, with sky lanes instead of hedgerows. The German intellectual response hardened into sociology. Walter Model concluded that if the reports were accurate, the adversary was not simply a superior army, but a superior civilization, a society that could convert factories directly into movement and morale into noise. When subordinates proposed interdiction of the highways by a diminished Luftwaffe, arithmetic provided the veto. The enemy ran about 6,000 trucks. Even the destruction of 1,000, an impossibility, would be replaced within a week. Germany lacked even 200 aircraft to sustain daily destruction of 200 trucks. Strategy buckled under production. On the ground, the sensory economy decided morale. German units rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day. At Metz endured American artillery that could fire 100,000 rounds in 24 hours, with the red ball delivering every shell plus a buffer for the next day. To a quartermaster, that is throughput. To a foxhole, it is inevitability. The climax is conceptual. When an army can adapt faster than friction accumulates, crisis becomes a ratchet, not a break. Falling action reads like improvisation, formalized. Extensions opened with painted markers, white ball, green diamond, red lion, A, B, C, inside 2 days. French buses carried personnel so that trucks could carry only cargo. Captured German vehicles rolled under fresh olive drab. Bulldozers heaped rubble into usable roadbeds around shattered bridges. What began as an exception became a doctrine. Simplify, substitute, keep the interval. The road answered stress by widening into a moving city. Discontinuation can be a triumph when it is planned. The Red Ball Express officially ended on the 16th of November, 1944, as railheads reached forward enough to assume the heavy lift. The ledger that closed with it is both austere and devastating. 82 operating days, 412,193 tons delivered, roughly 122 million ton miles recorded, an average of about 5,958 trucks in service with peaks near 7,000. Some 23,000 drivers, on the order of 57 million gallons consumed, more than 180,000 tires worn out. Something above 5,000 vehicles destroyed or abandoned costs around $100 million. The numbers are not decoration, they are the argument. They describe a polity that turned availability into a weapon. This strategic meaning was acknowledged before the ink dried. By the middle of September, Gerd von Rundstedt told his staff that the Americans had made distance irrelevant. The culminating point assumed by German planning did not exist. When subordinates suggested highway interdiction from the air, the reply was a theorem in the negative. We cannot destroy trucks as fast as they appear. This was not a defeat by maneuver, but by industrial arithmetic. The social meaning sharpened the victory's edge. The workforce had been majority African American in a segregated army, their competence a factual refutation of Nazi ideology and an inconvenient mirror for American democracy. Dwight Eisenhower, watching drivers who had been at it 20 hours, conceded aloud that they were winning the war as surely as any infantry, a line his aide Harry Butcher recorded. Such recognitions did not desegregate the Army overnight, but they stocked the post-war argument with evidence. Equality had a mileage log and a delivery receipt. Economic logic closes the loop. Each day of war cost the United States roughly $250 million. If the red ball shortened the European conflict, by even the 6 months some planners estimated, then its $100 million bill was not excess but thrift. Speed pays compound interest in lives and treasure saved. Veterans who had learned to run a continent-scale transportation network at continuous tempo returned to build trucking firms, advise on interstate design, and normalize the assumption that a 24-hour logistics clock was not an emergency measure but a business model. There is a coda of memory and symbol. In 1994, a commemorative stamp honored the Red Ball Express, reminding a peacetime public that a decisive instrument of victory wore no turret and fired no shell. Former enemies had long since admitted as much. Some, like Hase von Manteuffel, told interrogators that once the scale of American logistics was clear, resistance was hopeless. Others, including Albert Kesselring, when pressed on what most surprised them about American power, named not tanks or planes, but trucks. Resolution, then, is not sentiment, but a rule of art for modern war. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. In the European theater, that aphorism ceased to be a sneer and became a plan. The highways kept their ruts, the archives keep their numbers, and strategy keeps the truth that trucks at interval can move not only shells and gasoline, but calendars. The convoy ended on a November date. Its method still rolls.